So, the book, the title.
Yes, ma'am.
It's something that, of course, you know, it caught me in a very positive way, obviously. But can you talk more about that? Embracing the world.
Yeah, I meant that, I think, in two ways. One having to do with Fethullah Gülen's intellectual history, which is so Catholic, small c, that, and it's something that I explore in the book. One can see the influence on him, and he talks about the importance of thinkers that range from Socrates to Einstein and everybody in between. So in that sense, but of course the more significant and profound sense is the way in which he charts such a distinct and direct and completely universalist kind of course with respect to really not only humanity, because that would be important enough, but really his consideration of the planet as a whole, and finds no contradiction between the specifics of what he is as a Muslim and how he is as a human, not only with a relationship to all of humanity, but basing himself really on the concept of stewardship that one extracts out of Quran 2:28-29, talking about the kind of responsibility that he and therefore we as humans have for the whole world around us.
Right. Another, or shall I say, moving forward into the book, distinction that you're making in the book, and maybe that needs further clarification, between the ideologies of pantheism and panhenotheism. And can you speak more about this?
Absolutely. Sure.
Maybe further clarify.
No, in fact, I was at pains to clarify that, and when the book was in the process of editing, the initial editors took great umbrage at my use of the word panhenotheism, because it was clear from their comments that they mistook it for pantheism.
Exactly.
And pantheism, of course, is when we see gods all around us. If you think of the ancient Greeks, for example, they have the Olympians, Zeus and Hera and that crowd, and then there are lesser gods and goddesses, daimones, like Calypso and Circe, whom Odysseus encounters in the Odyssey. And then there are dryads and naiads. If you think of Book 2 of the Iliad, Achilles, in his furor, once he comes back into battle, at one point is battling the Scamander River, and the river is personified and anthropomorphized even as it is a river. So that's pantheism. There are gods all around us.
Right.
Panhenotheism, on the other hand, is made up of three elements. Theos is a Greek word for God, and heno is a Greek word for one, and pan is all or everything. So panhenotheism is to see the one God in everything. So it is the recognition that the Creator is expressed throughout the creation. It is a kind of view that goes against a narrower view that perhaps would see, well, God in us, because there's a little bit of God in us as a species, and sees God in everything, from stones and flowers to dogs to cats to humans. Different ways in which God is present, but God everywhere, but the one God present everywhere. And that's an idea that Gulen himself explores, and it's an idea that one can see his exploring in part as an influence on him of other prior thinkers, most particularly Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and people of that ilk.
Right. I think that it's, and this is something that comes up obviously not just with Gulen and trying to understand his theology, but it comes up, I think, for Sufis and in general, and possibly, you know, and others from other religions. But I think this is something that, you know, could be a matter of language and trying to understand context. But I think that the great thing about this book is that it offers the reader, you know, information on Sufism and mysticism. It gives it, you know, a lot of this information is had if you want to go and, you know, you read several volumes, you know, especially Ibn Arabi and of course the Methnui of Rumi, and but you very nicely give it to the reader concisely and in a few pages, and I think this is very important actually in trying to understand Gulen and where he's coming from. But I also think it's quite nice because, you know, if one just wants to understand Sufism and the great Sufis.
Right.
Can you speak more about maybe that kind of transformation within Gülen and how that came apart of your wanting to do this book? Because I think that you know, that culminates
Sure.
into
well,
those reasons.
I've long had an interest in mysticism, and as you mentioned before, I've written a fair amount about it, including that book. When someone approached me and asked if I would perhaps be interested in writing something about Gülen, from my own angle of interest, the first thing that I thought of was mysticism, and but I didn't know whether it would work, because I had read just a little bit of Gülen at that point. But then I read not all, but most of what he has written, at least that is available in English, and it worked for me perfectly well. I see him as having reached a point in his own spiritual and intellectual development, which is the point to which a mystic, by definition, wants to arrive. I mean, if the goal ultimately of a mystic is to become filled with Godness, to be filled with God, you have to empty yourself of self. And of course, there's a challenge to be able to do that. There's a danger, because if I can't get myself back, then I've died, or I've gone crazy, or I've apostatized. So the goal is to do that and to come back from it. In order to empty myself of self, I have to realize that my spirituality is part of a much larger phenomenon of spirituality. If I keep thinking of it as mine, then self is still there, and I can't be filled with God. And that's so much of what, well, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and of course in particular Fethullah Gülen is about. Emptying yourself of self in the mystical sense so that you can be filled spiritually. And of course he carries it a step further, because his interest is also in then activating it in the world of the here and now. But that's also part of what the mystical goal really is.
Right, you mentioned this, and I found that very interesting, actually. You make that connection between that selflessness, that emptying of the self, but it can't be completed without it being in connection with the others in the community, and
absolutely, because if my goal is to achieve enlightenment, that's a selfish goal. My goal has to be to achieve enlightenment so that I can, in that condition, benefit the world around me, embracing the world. Whether it's a smaller community, the whole community of creation, it's got to be other than myself as my goal. And therefore, by definition, my goal has to be to come back and activate what I've gained from that experience in the world with good works, however those good works are defined.
And I want to come back to that, but before we do that, I want to read a section of the book, a section of Ibn Arabi, speaking to the way in which Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and Gülen are solid, as you may say, die-in-the-wool Muslims and yet universalists. So Ibn Arabi writes, "Wonder, a garden among the flames. My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for the idol's sacred ground, Kaaba, for the circling pilgrim, the tablets of the Torah, the pages of the Quran. My creed is love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is my belief, my faith." And further, and some may be very familiar with this, Rumi says, "I go into the mosque, the Muslim mosque, and the Jewish synagogue, and the Christian church, and I see one altar."
Absolutely.
So.
And I think of the Ibn Arabi, "My creed is love." I mean, that's just strewn throughout everything that Gülen writes. Again, if my relationship, the relationship with God that as a mystic I wish to have, is a love relationship, and in Sufism that concept really originates with Rabia.
Yeah, I was just going
Right?
to say.
The concept of mahabba and
Right.
the idea that the lover and the beloved
Right.
and love become indistinguishable from
Right.
each other.
Right.
I want God, God wants me. I'm the lover, God is the beloved. God is the lover, I'm the beloved. We can't be distinguished. And again, there's the danger. I can't get myself back. Right? So Al-Halaj comes back out of this ecstatic condition and is yelling, Ana al-Haq, right? I am truth, or I am God. And he's executed as a heretic because they misunderstand.
Right.
It's not that he's a heretic or that he's an egotist, it's exactly the opposite. He hasn't reclaimed himself, he's so filled with God he can't distinguish himself from God. But if the basis for that is love, and if God is found throughout creation, then an obvious concomitant of loving God and being loved by God is loving creation.
Right.
And that's what Ibn Arabi is talking about, and that's what Gülen talks about again and again.
Right, right. And to be able to see that, it's really essentially understanding the I.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but what do you do with that? Because
Exactly.
we still have a physical form, we're still able to, do things, and so, and in order to get there, to see in creation, God
Right.
manifested. So I want to move on to, move on to what we were talking about earlier in service, and something that Gülen has written, and this is from The Believer Standing Before God. Gülen says, "The believer loves everyone and everything for God's sake. He breathes with love at all times, forming an atmosphere of love around himself. He rushes to stop the cries of mourning wherever he hears them, and he applies balm to the afflictions of others. He turns tears into laughter, helpless moans into praises to God, and storms of fire into the breezes of divine grace. He suffers so that others may not suffer. His tears flow so that others may not weep. And if he does not serve others, he considers himself worthless." So you write of the issues of egolessness and altruism, both being a part in particular to leading to the Hizmet
Right.
community, to the Hizmet movement, as being very important, and maybe the way that Gülen draws from so much of this inspiration. So can you speak more about
Oh,
this?
absolutely. One of the things that distinguishes Gülen from Ibn Arabi and Rumi, or Socrates, is that his vision of the world is necessarily so much broader because of the world in which he lives, but also because of the way in which he thinks of activating loving the world. And so the idea of hizmet, Turkish word for service, right? That one ought to, the ideal way to be in the world is to function in an altruistic manner where one does things for others, not for oneself, is an obvious concomitant of the idea that my desire to become one with God won't work if it's all about my desire for me to become one with God, my desire to be enlightened.
Right.
It's got to be for a purpose beyond myself. Otherwise, I'm still too filled with self, and it won't happen. So, and the wonderful thing about the Hizmet movement, you see, is that you don't have to be a mystic to be part of it. You just have to buy into the ethical beauty of serving others. And so one sees that. I can only speak of my limited personal experience, seeing that, for example, in visiting schools that have been founded, inspired by, or under the aegis of the Hizmet movement, where you just invariably encounter teachers, administrators, people who are very clearly devoted to others than to themselves. And it's not just that they are available to their students before hours and after hours, but they really are available. Right. It's not just a pro forma, it's substantive.
Right. Yeah, so often we've taken groups of folks to Turkey from Washington here, and
oh, yes.
we have dinners. Typically it's at the end of a tourism day.
Yes.
And we have dinners at the schools or something like this, and I don't think we've ever been to a school that hasn't, especially if it's during the school year, but that there isn't a teacher in a room, chemistry or what have you, but trying to help her students to get to some point with, you know, either college testing or some sort of a fair or something like this. But yeah, I mean, that sort of, I mean, obviously can find that in other communities, but I think that, you know, specifically speaking about Gulen and the Hizmet movement, this is something that is, you know, is something unique. So it's really, I mean.
But you know, you're right. You can find it in other communities.
Totally can.
But the issue is, Gülen's version is informed specifically by Islam. So that's why he can be an Islamist. In the purest sense of that word, not the common parlance misappropriation of that word, in the purest sense of that word, and universalist, just as others from other traditions.
And that's what I meant by
that.
unique, and you said it very well. I think, yeah, I couldn't have said it better. So.